The Halo series has been around for over 20 years now. Yes, that does make me feel old, thank you for asking. And in that time, the franchise has branched out from just being a first-person shooter series, from toys to TV shows and even to tabletop games. The most recent of which is Halo Flashpoint, a new skirmish game from Mantic Games coming out later this month. And rather nicely, Mantic have sent us a demo copy to check out.
Starting with looking at what you get in the box. Although before we do, we just want to point out, as ever with these kinds of videos, that no money has changed hands between us and Mantic. They just sent us the box, and at no point have they told us that we can or can't say anything. So everything here is our own thoughts. Okay, let's crack open the box. So in the box you get the paperwork, the board, which is actually less of a board and more thick paper that never really sits quite as flat as you'd like, the flat pack terrain and tokens, the character and equipment cards, dice, and finally, the minis. The cardboard terrain goes together nice and obviously, although you do get instructions if you're lost, and the big structures are reversible so you can get two different looks out of each piece, which is a neat touch. Although since it is just card, maybe be a little mindful when putting it together each time to avoid premature damage. As for the minis, you get 8 pre-assembled Spartans in this set, 4 red, 4 blue. We never really watched red versus blue, so feel free to insert your own reference to it here.
Both teams share the same 4 sculpts, and, if you're curious about how big they are, here's one next to a Warhammer 40k Primaris Space Marine, a Mantic Marauder, and a pink LEGO Spaceman and Child. The detail on them looks pretty good, although in some areas I kinda feel like it possibly should have been simplified more for this scale, as it gets a little muddy. This is an issue I've also noticed on some of Mantic's other minis too, but is less apparent when painted, to be fair. Annoyingly though, several of the bases are a little warped so they don't sit flat. We believe this is due to the fact that they're moulded attached to the bodies to make the whole pre-assembly thing easier. Sure, there's ways to fix that, like using hot water to bend it back into shape or sanding down the bottom till it's flat, but needing to fix something like that right out the box does make them feel a little bit less quality than they otherwise would. Still, these are all based on armour you can wear in the video games. They're all from Halo Infinite specifically, according to our local friendly Halo expert. So that's neat. I imagine many people will be wanting to try and find minis that vaguely match their own in-game Spartans, so I wouldn't be shocked if they released multi-part kits later down the line with all sorts of different combinations if the game gets enough of a player base. And speaking of the game, how is it? Well, as people who have played the occasional Halo game over the years but aren't what you'd call Halo mega fans, the thing that attracted us most to the game is more that it's being marketed as something easy for anyone to pick up and play, and accessible tabletop games are something we care a lot about. This is why they've gone with the pre-assembled colour-coded minis. You don't have to do the hobby part if you don't want to. It makes it simple even for people who have no experience with miniature wargaming to jump right in. In fact, the game's rules are based on Mantic's tried and tested Dead Zone rules, a game we have played before, but it was a while ago so we barely remember it, so for us we were basically learning the rules for the first time again.
The basics of the mechanics will likely feel familiar even if you haven't played Dead Zone though. It's one of those you roll some dice, they roll some dice, and you compare successes kind of deals. With the basic roll being 3d8s that can be added to via various abilities and conditions. For example, if you have a clear shot at an enemy, you get 2 extra attack dice, and rolling an 8 gives you a headshot, which means you get to add another die. And yes, this applies to non-shooting rolls too, even though it's still called a headshot. Don't worry about it. Players take turns activating individual minis until every mini on the board has been activated. When that has happened, a new round begins. The default size for a fire team is 4 minis each, so the individual rounds don't take super long once you've got the hang of it. Movement and range are entirely handled by the play space being arranged into squares, so you don't need to bust out any tape measures or whippy sticks. The movement and range is described in squares, or should I say cubes, because this does apply in all 3 dimensions if you want to climb up on top of something. Honestly, it's pretty simple to pick up, the only tricky part is just remembering what all the weapon abilities do, but you will figure that out after a few games. Although naming two abilities that appear next to each other as rapid fire and weight of fire feels like it's there to deliberately trip you up.
So far, this is all pretty standard stuff, but the really neat part is how the game is ultimately just a tabletop interpretation of Halo's multiplayer PvP, right down to the explanation that the Spartan-on-Spartan warfare is all wargames used for training. So it's a tabletop wargame simulation of a virtual simulation of a fictional wargame. Or something like that. So as well as having their armour, the Spartans have regenerating shields, represented by these little counters, that need to be knocked down before actually damaging them. They refill a little bit at the start of each round, and they have a 2-weapon loadout. You know, it's all the stuff that every FPS released after Halo copied from Halo. And yes, having 2 weapon slots means that, as well as the weapon they start with, troops can pick up one of the extra randomly spawned weapons knocking around the board. You'll be happy to know this includes the energy sword that allows you to poke people from 1 cube over. Spanking is also an option. There's also random war gear pickups like grenades, health packs, and even a thing that allows you to go invisible for a bit. Oh, and you respawn. Any dead troops can respawn if they haven't already been activated that round at one of the pre-designated respawn points, so death isn't permanent. Which does mean that even if you've had a really bad round and lost half your fire team, that's not automatically a defeat. They'll be back. And this recreation of video game mechanics extends to the game types, which are also from the games, like Slayer, Capture the Flag, and Oddball. So even the most basic kill all the other dudes game type is still a little different, since it's not until everyone's dead, they'll respawn, the game goes until you reach a certain frag count. There's also command dice that you roll each round that you can spend on extra moving, extra shooting, stuff of that nature. It's not really relevant to the emulation of the video games, we just didn't really know where else in the video to mention it.
Having played a few games of Flashpoint now, we can say that we've enjoyed it. It's very easy to pick up, flows well, and the elements they've borrowed from the video games gives it its own flair, when it could have very easily been just a paint-by-numbers skirmish game with Halo flavouring. The small teams and respawning makes for a game where you never really need to deal with too many moving parts at once, while also not needing to be too concerned if your sniper gets one-shot. The biggest issue we had initially was just telling the minis apart, since they do have different stats, but at tabletop distances, a Spartan kind of just looks like every other Spartan, especially when unpainted. Plus, nobody's wielding any really distinct weapons like a needler in this set to help them stand out. But you do get used to it, and it could be entirely solved by simply painting them distinctly. Plus, if you're having trouble telling them apart, their card art is the same pose as the mini, which just kinda makes us wish that the poses were a little bit more varied for easier readability. Also, a minor complaint, but we kinda wish the box came with more dice. When rolling off against each other, it's not uncommon for one person to end up needing more than 6 of them. So you have to use some of both colours in the box, which feels wrong. I mean, D8s are cheap, so if it bothers us that much, I guess we could just buy more. But it does happen quite a lot, so it's mildly disappointing they gave you the bare minimum amount for the players to roll with.
Now we come to the price. The demo copy we're looking at here is actually the basic Recon edition set, which has an RRP of £60, although you can find it a bit cheaper at various retailers. There's also a bigger, fancier Spartan edition for £100, with a bunch of extra stuff, again, slightly cheaper at the retailers. And if you wanted even more, there's already a whole host of stuff up for pre-order. So we can see that a new fire team of 4 minis is going to cost £25, and you'll be able to replace that kind of flimsy feeling board in the Recon set with a nice mat, although it'll cost you 30 quid. Unless you already have a Dead Zone mat lying around, and then you can just use that. It's the same size. Mantic's Dead Zone terrain will also work with it if you don't like the cardboard stuff, and if you don't believe us, here's a pre-order for some terrain that looks suspiciously similar to the Dead Zone plastic stuff, but with Halo branding. Also, the omission of any kind of points values for building custom fire teams in here will seemingly be addressed in the Wargames expansion next year. And of course there'll be a Master Chief mini. He'll count as 2 minis in a fire team if you were curious. But is this box on its own worth £60? Well, given how expensive things have gotten in the wargaming space, That doesn't feel bad at all. Even with just what is here, you have several game types to play through with a lot of possible variation, and with plenty of scope for expansion, both big and small. Plus, it is a fun game. I feel that does need to be said. We did have a good time playing it, and are intrigued to see what gets added to it over time. This good feeling is just slightly undermined by things like the cheat mat and the wobbly bases that put a slight tarnish on an otherwise pleasant experience.
And how well does it fulfill the role of being an easy to pick up game for beginners? Well, with the lack of mini-assembly, the cardboard terrain, and a simple and easy to pick up rule set, it does feel like a good way to ease someone familiar with Halo into tabletop gaming. You can play a game right out of the box with the only assembly needed being the terrain, which all goes together in minutes. And even if you don't fully get into the game, what's here is standalone enough that it could be pulled out to be played occasionally on board game night, provided someone is vaguely familiar with the rules. Truth be told, you don't even have to be that into Halo to get something out of it. Being into Halo just helps when you're trying to figure things out like what gun is what, or why your Halo fan friends look exasperated when you keep pointing to every Spartan and asking if that one is Master Chief.
So thank you to Mantic for sending us this to check out ahead of release.
And thank you for watching. What?
That's all you know about Halo, isn't it? It's just what.